Medieval England was black, but also racist, according to a new article from both the BBC and The Guardian this week. But are either of those claims true? Find out today on Survive the Jive. The New Guardian article refers to the work of Dr Rebecca Redfern, who is a curator at the Museum of London. I've referred to her work before on this channel in the context of her dubious claims about bits of bones found in Roman cemeteries in London allegedly belonging to black people. Now she's making the same kind of claims, but about medieval people in London. As in the previous study on Roman DNA, her work does not rely on genome-wide analysis studies, which look at autosomal DNA, that's detailed DNA of the whole of the genome of a skeleton, which can clearly determine the racial ancestry of an individual. Instead, she relies on far less rigorous methods, which I will explain later in this video. The Guardian first refers to a chapter she wrote in a 2019 book called Bioarchaeology of Marginalized People. And the title was of the chapter, Officially Absent but Actually Present. And that's in reference to the fact that archaeologists have anecdotally observed that some remains could potentially have belonged to non-whites, but they have not been officially recorded as such. So they're trying to say that they probably were, even though we don't actually know they were, and there's been no thorough analysis to prove they were. That study was linked to by The Guardian as evidence of the diversity of medieval England, even though it does not prove that at all. By the way, this chapter from this book in 2019 is not the source that the BBC and The Guardian are using to justify these claims from Rebecca Redfern about the alleged racism of medieval England and the suffering of black people in the plague times in London. That's actually a different paper, which isn't even linked to and hasn't come out yet, but I'll talk about that in a bit. This chapter from 2019 focuses on 41 skeletons from a medieval cemetery in London called East Smithfield. The identification of the races of the skeleton was based mainly on their skull shapes, but only 8 had complete crania that were sufficiently not smashed to pieces that they could be used for this technique. And since this meant that there was missing data, Dr. Redfern and colleagues decided to impute missing data with the stated goal of generation of plausible values over more accurate values. In layman's terms, that means they made it up. But what about the actual data they did get from those skulls that weren't smashed in? That was reliable, right? So, besides DNA, there are 3 other techniques used to identify the origins, ethnic origins of a skeleton, or geographic origins. One is isotope analysis, and that looks at the enamel on the teeth. And from that, you can get a pretty good idea of what they were eating when they were a child and where the water they were drinking came from. So from that, you can argue to some extent where they grew up, although not with a huge accuracy because different types of places have similar water types, but you can get a good idea. The second is called craniometry, and that's based on the measured dimensions of the skull, which can be used to estimate one's racial origins. And the third is very similar, and that's called macromorphoscopics. And it looks at the non-measurable traits of a skull, such as the shape of the eye sockets and the nose cavity, the nasal cavity, to determine racial origins. However, none of these 3 techniques are 100% reliable. A good example of this is in this case of Beachy Head Lady, who was found in East Sussex, Roman-era skeleton in Britain. Analysis of her skull made people think she could be African. Analysis of isotope teeth made it look like she was raised in the Mediterranean, so people thought maybe she was from North Africa. But then, years later, they did an actual autosomal DNA study of her bones and looked at where she really came from, it turned out she grew up in Croatia. She was Croatian. She had no African ancestry at all. So clearly we can't take macromorphoscopics or craniometry 100% seriously as a source when we're looking at the skeletons, especially when the skeletons aren't complete. A 2003 paper from Joe Hefner at Michigan State University, who actually co-authored the chapter of this book with Dr. Redfern, determined that one of the skull traits used to identify people as black is only found in 40% of people with African ancestry. And it's actually even more common in people who are not Africans. In fact, Dr. Redfern and Hefner admit that their methods aren't reliable in this book chapter. When their methods identified a skull as being probably Asian, they rejected this as a false positive result on the grounds that medieval Londoners had wider faces than modern Londoners, who were used as a sample base for estimating ethnicity, and are therefore being falsely identified as East Asians based on skull shape when using the macromorphoscopic method. Only 3 of the 41 skeletons in that study were selected for DNA analysis, but not a thorough analysis, autosomal DNA, which would have reliably told us about their ancestry, just their mitochondrial haplogroup, which is a uniparental marker everybody has. They inherited only from their mother, and it shows the deep ancestry on your mother's side. So your mother's mother going thousands of years back in time. You can't determine someone's race this way. You can't, because you could have, if you have like your 23rd great grandmother, like 1,000 years ago, or even someone who lived 5,000 years ago who was black, and you would have their mitochondrial haplogroup, but you would have no black ancestry besides that. So you would be 100% white. So it wouldn't be a way of determining race unless you can see the autosomal DNA. It might be an indicator, since like mitochondrial haplogroups are found more frequently in some populations than others. So if you find someone with a certain haplogroup, you might predict they're more likely to belong to a certain ethnic or racial group. But it's not actual proof of ethnicity at all. Anyway, of those 3, only one of them actually yielded valid DNA results. And this person had U5B2A5 haplogroup. And that's very closely related to my maternal haplogroup, which is U5B1D. And both of those come from indigenous European hunter-gatherers. And they're very common in Europe today, and they are native to Europe. But this paper, this chapter in this book says that it's found in Tajikistan. And it doesn't say that it originates in Europe, doesn't tell people that, or even look at the history of that haplogroup to let people know that it's only in Tajikistan because Europeans in the Bronze Age took it that out there with the Indo-European expansions. So anyway, this skeleton, the only one with any DNA in that study that they can actually look at, has a European haplogroup. Now, that doesn't prove they're European, but it does mean they're more likely to be European than anything else. But despite this, without any proof except skull measurements, Redfern concludes this person was of mixed ancestry, including black African ancestry. And the crux of the chapter that they're writing is that black people were found in this cemetery and were a part of medieval London, but they don't actually have any concrete evidence for that claim. But as I said before, these news articles from the BBC and The Guardian aren't actually relying on this earlier work by Redfern. It's just the only source they provide. Instead, rather they're referring to an as yet unpublished entry in the journal Bioarchaeology International. That means the journalists wrote these articles based on an unfalsifiable press release likely sent to them by Redfern herself. We're told that in the newer study that we can't see, Redfern and co. looked at 145 skeletons from 3 medieval cemeteries this time, but one of those is the same one that the 2019 study looked at. So I expect that 41 of those 145 skeletons are the same 41 that they already looked at. Of these 145 samples, 49 are thought to have died from plague. Using the same questionable techniques as before, they reckon that 9 out of those 145 skeletons were part black. And 8 out of those 9 died of plague. And since more of those allegedly black-looking skulls were plague victims than weren't, they conclude there was racism in medieval London. And that racism caused this disparity. And this is then sloppily compared to the recent pandemic in order to try and make it topical. Because apparently black people suffered worse from that pandemic than white people. What's more, the skulls seemed to be more female than male, and therefore it was not only racist but also sexist, particularly sexist against black medieval women of colour in London, who I'm sure formed an abundant proportion of the population. Do you feel bad, bigot? Do you feel bad about your medieval ancestors yet? Funnily enough, Redfern contributed to an earlier paper in 2019 entitled Genetic Resiliency and the Black Death, No Apparent Loss of Mitogenomic Diversity Due to the Black Death in Medieval London and Denmark. In this, the authors found that the loss of huge portions of the urban populations in Northern Europe did not alter the typical maternal lineages found in those populations. And that's probably, you could quite reasonably conclude, because the ethnic composition of those populations was not altered. However, that's not the conclusion they come to. She says, quite rightly and correctly, that you can't identify race by maternal lineage. She says that herself in this paper, but okay. And then concludes that likely was very diverse. But that's not any proof of that. She doesn't provide any proof. And in fact, the only DNA evidence they got seems to contradict that. But yeah, you can see the kind of way they like to interpret data. This sort of thing is typical of Dr. Rebecca Redfern. In 2015, the media reported on a Roman skeleton from London dubbed Lant Street Girl, and a preliminary DNA analysis showed she probably had blue eyes and blonde hair. Yet macromorphoscopics led to a study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science claiming that she likely had African ancestry. Then the BBC went further when reporting on that and said her skeleton suggested she had sub-Saharan African ancestry specifically, and thus she magically became a Black Briton. Dr. Redfern's study with the Museum of London at the time was called Written in Bone, and that actually says that this skeleton's maternal ancestry can be traced to southeastern Europe. Again, you're looking at DNA, all the DNA pointing at her being European in terms of phenotype and in maternal ancestry, but there's no proper aDNA to show for sure either way. But very, very likely that this blonde-haired, blue-eyed person with a European maternal lineage was not black, despite being described as a Black Briton based on skull measurements. When I asked Dr. Redfern about this years ago, she told me that there would be a follow-up study, genetic study on Lant Street Girl in 2019, where they'd actually look at her autosomal DNA and, give conclusive answers about her ancestry. But I never actually saw anything about that, so if it was published, it escaped my notice. If you know for sure what the autosomal DNA results of Lant Street Girl are, please let me know in the comments. A lot of Redfern's work seems to push this narrative that ancient Britain and medieval Britain were always racially diverse, and she's willing to fudge data and overlook inconvenient facts to support this narrative. A narrative which presents a distorted image of the past. In the 2019 book chapter previously mentioned, she specifically cites the increasing interest by the far right in medieval history as the reason why it is important for her to make sure black people are, I quote, present and correct in the archaeological record, presumably by any means necessary, including neglecting full autosomal DNA analysis of relevant skeletons which would conclusively prove their ancestry, and relying on a dubious methodology made even less reliable by the imputation of data where skulls are in too bad of a shape to make any reliable conclusions about their racial origins. These kind of people and these sorts of studies are a cancer in academia, and they bring the field of archaeology into disrepute among the general public, who intuitively sense that this sort of thing is propaganda, anti-white, left-wing propaganda intended to make the public accept mass immigration today on the basis that it is allegedly always a part of our past. There has never, ever been anywhere near the scale of migration into this island that is happening right now, and nothing they can say will change that fact. I'd like to thank the Twitter user Clifford Swan for providing screenshots of that paywalled book chapter from 2019, which I've used in this video. This channel is called Survive the Jive. I've got lots of history documentaries you can check out. I also occasionally do these kind of debunking videos where left-wing people distort our past. But generally I like to talk about the history and religions of this island and other parts of Northern Europe and even the Mediterranean. Take a look through some of my videos and enjoy what you find. Thanks for watching.